There it is. So I am here and I welcome you all to choose to challenge yourselves to engage in today's conversation. We are happy to have you all here. Myself, Dr. Misra, who is a professor in the Gender and Women's Studies Department, as well as Dr. Kirsten Isgro, who is a professor in the Communications and Studies Department. We are going to begin today's program with a land acknowledgement for those who've come before us and have allowed us the opportunity to be able to do this today.
Yes, so we want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories for those that are in the Plattsburgh area of the Abenaki peoples. I'm calling in from Burlington, Vermont, which is where the Mohawk peoples landed and live. And we've got the east or the west coast of the Coast Salish people. And in recognizing the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside on, and also as a way of acknowledging that Indigenous people have been living and working the land for generations. So welcome. And again, I'm really happy to be here, and thank you to my leadership class for sharing their time. So do you want to talk a little bit about International Women's Day? Aisha, do you want to say anything, or should I just launch right into it?
You're good, go ahead.
Okay. So I don't know how many of you have heard of International Women's Day, but it has a very rich history. March 8th, today, is International Women's Day, and it's a global day of celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. And my leadership communication course, this week's topic of discussion is power in leadership, and it seemed like a very nice marriage of discussion. March 8th has also been declared as a day for accelerating gender parity. And if we can give a little bit of historical context, and we're hoping to have more of a conversation about this event and this day. In 1908, 15,000 women marched through New York City, demanding shorter hours, better pay, and voting rights. Keep in mind, here in the US, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. The official International Women's Day gathered in 1911 in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. And more than 1 million women and men attended the International Women's rallies, campaigning for women's right to work, vote, be trained, to hold public office, and end discrimination. What is interesting to me about that 1911 moment is that a week later, those of you that grew up in the New York City, you may have heard of the Triangle Fire, where more than 140 working women, most of them Italian, Jewish immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, died, mainly because the work conditions were such that the owners of the building did not want the working women to leave, and so they were essentially locked in. And this disastrous event drew significant attention in terms of looking at the working conditions and labor legislation in the United States that then subsequently became International Women's Day. And with the migration of women and the labor of women, we can look at the mills. At that time, during the Industrial Revolution, we saw women and men really rising to the occasion in terms of giving worker rights. And what started in the US as a Bread and Roses campaign went transnational. This originated from a speech that was given by an American women's suffrage activist, Helen Todd. And in the line of one of that, her speech said, you know, we want bread for all, but roses too. Very much appealing to both fair wages and dignified work conditions. And for me, I see there's a lot of parallels when we're here today with International Women's Day, is looking at the millions of people who were fighting for better work conditions and pay in 1911 and how things are today in 2021. We're in the middle of a pandemic. This very moment, there's a 4-story Amazon warehouse the size of 15 football fields located in Alabama. And they are attempting, the first attempt to unionize the large US Amazon facility. And if the majority of those 6,000 workers choose to vote to opt for unionization, they're going to earn the right to bargain for a contract with Amazon. So they're very much within this larger tradition of workers demanding dignity and respect and a balance between livelihood and a meaningful life. So we'll talk a little bit more in terms of how does this all relate to leadership and power. The 2021 theme for International Women's Day, as was already said, was to choose to challenge. And when we think about this long history of labor rights, I think it's really important for us to think about power. And for those of you in my leadership class, today we were talking about power. For those of you that have not been in my leadership class, there's a number of themes that we have been talking about. One is that leaders, they're not necessarily naturally born. They are roles that we assume, or sometimes we are given, sometimes we take. The other thing is that leadership is a process. And for those in the communication department, we're particularly fascinated in the way in which leadership is a communicative process. And so when we look at power and leadership, not all that are in powerful positions are leaders. Not all leaders are in powerful positions. And we can see that if we look at the history of labor in this country and transnationally, that often people take on roles of leadership in really profound ways in lots of different arenas. I'm curious if I could hear from anybody in my class how you imagine power relating to the workforce and some of the conversations we've been having throughout the semester. I don't want to call on anybody, but I would love if someone wanted to sort of share how they imagine power relating to leadership. Everyone's going to be so shy. So, you know, we can look at power within organizations and the ways in which leadership may serve as oppressive or coercive, making people do things that they do not want to do, punish them in terms of wages, not giving them health benefits, not giving them a livable wage, which is also one of the big things that we're thinking about right now in this country. Getting a $15 an hour minimum wage seems virtually impossible. We can also see how leadership can be a source of reward, and that who's giving those rewards, who's giving those punishments, and who rises as a leader, and that leadership is only possible if you've got followers, if you have people that are willing to go along with the plan, or if they are not, how do they resist that? And so when we think about the International Women's Day, I want us to think about this long legacy of people that have skirted this tension between power, leadership, followers. How do we gain dignity? How do we earn dignity? How do we get respect as workers? And part of the way we were imagining landing this discussion is thinking about hidden labor in parenting, hidden labor in caregiving for an elderly parent, maybe for a sibling, thinking about how we contribute to society and what gets valued and what doesn't. And often leadership looks a particular way. It's very gendered, it's very racialized, it's very sexualized in particular ways. And who gets left out of that model of who constitutes a leader. And so part of our conversation today is showing a video that addresses the issue of parenting as one particular topic of concern and interest for a lot of us, and certainly impacts not just women, men, and those that may not necessarily identify in those binaries. So let's talk about the video that we're going to watch.
All right, so I'm going, oh, go ahead. Nope, I see you, go ahead.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to share the video, but I'm also going to put the link to the video because as we all have experienced by now with Zoom, sometimes it does not move as fast as the audio on the clip. So the link is going to be in the chat if you would like to mute from this side in order to watch on your own. Or if you would like to watch the video again at your own time. All right.
I just wanted to add here that I've also dropped in a couple of links for people who are interested. You can pursue this at a later time. One is a link about a very brief history of Women's Day, specifically, Working Women's Day, which is what this day originated as, and the state of the women around the world today. And another is the usage of the word women with an X, what that, why we're increasingly using different ways to denote women, because by all means here we want to, when we talk about women, we want to include everybody irrespective of gender and sexuality, right? All the women irrespective of gender and sexuality. So there is also a list of questions, Zyaijah, that we had. If you could drop that as well. Part of the exercise here, as we watch this video, and I hope these guiding questions will be useful to us, just bringing it all together based on what Dr. Isgro just talked about, is to really seriously think about, I know we are all in different stages of life. Some of us are undergrad students, some of us joining us today are, faculty, some of us have been faculty for a long time, some of us are younger faculty, but we all at some point or the other, or most of us, find ourselves in the position of caregiving, whether it is, as a parent, as a primary caregiver. So really, to bring it home very personally in many ways, but also to think about all the major themes that Dr. Isgro just mentioned in terms of leadership, empowerment, work. What are our ideas that we need to challenge? Because it is all about choosing to challenge today when we think about work, life, home life, and the very gendered labor that goes into that. And we do have some statistics about that. We may be short of time, and I don't want to take away from the video and discussion. So maybe we can either put that in the chat box or send it across separately to you all as well.
Actually, why don't we take a little bit of time looking at some of those statistics that were in that?
Sure, it's just one slide, and maybe I can quickly share that. Or Zyaijah, do you want to just share that slide? I believe.
Is it being shown? You can see it?
Yeah, we will. See it.
Well, can we, yeah, let's go through some of these. I mean, part of when we look at the role of power and the role of labor, paid labor, we can see disparities in the sort of pipeline around gender and race. And this is US specific, unfortunately, or fortunately, but it gives you sort of a snapshot of entry-level positions based on sex and race, and then managerial positions, director positions, VPs, into the C-suite or the executives. And I've been using this pipeline analogy quite a bit in a lot of my classes, because what looks like a full playing field as you go down the pipeline, really there's limited amount of people that are actually coming out on the other end. I don't know if I can, I'm having a problem going over to the next slide.
Can you see it?
Yeah, some of you may have seen, again, this is sort of US specific, but we can talk transnationally. When we think about women in the workforce, women weren't actually counted in the Department of Labor. They weren't actually collecting this kind of data, tracking this data until 1948. And at that time in 1948, a third of women in the US held jobs. That has almost doubled by 1990. And yet you can still see that there is these profound pay discrepancies. And for some of you, this may be really basic information, but it's one of those things that bears repeating during International Women's Day because we still are seeing a lot of discrepancy. So even those that have college degrees, the orange is cis women and the green are cis men, and you can see there's discrepancies. And then I think it bears mentioning that when we look at COVID and the impact that that has had both on employment, but also caregiving, because again, caregiving is often invisible. It's not necessarily compensated in particular ways. Women have definitely been bearing the brunt of young children that are staying at home because of COVID and not going to school. Because we don't have daycare facilities that are readily available, but also fathers are being impacted, maybe not in such the same ways. And of course, this is also based on very heterosexual families where we can look at labor in and out of the house. And how many men and women have been dropping out of the workforce because of childcare or of caring for an elderly parent. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
Nope.
Okay.
No.
We can just go to the next slide if possible. Just one more thing that I wanted to highlight. The next one, Zyaijah, if you can skip that one. Yeah, just to bounce off what Dr. Isgro was saying, and this is actually taken from one of her own articles, and it's the data will be, there might be more recent data available, which I've put a link to that down below. But what a lot of time I just wanted to emphasize before we start the video, what statistics capture and don't capture. And that's something that we should be looking out for in this video as well, is the hidden work or the hidden labor that then goes behind the scenes, both at work and outside of work, right? So, if you see these statistics, majority of American women, between the ages of 15 and 50 are mothers. The percentage of women, as Dr. Isgro mentioned, who are now in the labor force is very high. And I think that last point where the traditional family is no longer the norm, right? So both in terms of where the father is not the sole breadwinner, we are talking about increasing households with single mothers, but also increasing non-traditional kinship-based households, right? So these could look like households with a number of permutations of the parents that are taking care of children of the elderly people who do not necessarily conform to the heteronormative gender and sexual norms as well, right? And that kind of, and then who does most of the work in that situation as well, right, is very gendered. So I think we just need to, as we watch the video, think about what the situation is statistically, but also what statistics don't show us. Yeah.
All right. So again, I put these questions into the chat. We're going to watch this nice TED Talk. And again, we want you to just be thinking about these questions. So in what ways can women be empowered to find job and home satisfaction? And think about the talk, right? We want to talk about some intersectionality there. Are there people missing from the conversation at hand in this TED Talk, right? And how can we make sure that here at SUNY Plattsburgh and in our personal lives, we ensure that we include all women? Then also, how do we or can we separate our professional and personal lives? And some of you, again, may be undergrads, but these are questions that you might already be thinking about in your future as you consider planning and what your future may look like. And lastly, would you like to add or to disagree with anything, right? So we want you all to critically think about it. Do you agree with anything that she's saying, or do you completely disagree as well? I'm going to go ahead and share and switch screens. Come on, 1 second. Did not work how I thought it would. Can you see the video? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have sound as well?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're lucky enough to have a job, chances are you have some job stress, maybe a little, maybe a lot. Now, if you're an American, there's a very good chance that you're overworked and your job stress is chronic. And if you have children or elderly parents to take care of, these competing demands on your time may be adding an extra layer, creating a tiramisu of stress. Some of you may secretly wonder, how long can I go at this pace? What happens if I reach my breaking point? I used to ask myself those questions a lot, and then 5 years ago, I did reach that breaking point. This is a photo of my family taken around that time. As you can see, it was all working on the surface. I had this loving husband, I had these beautiful children. That's my stepdaughter on the left and our other two on the right. And I had a fabulous job as a creative director at one of the best web design firms in San Francisco. It was a lot to juggle, but I was so determined to make it work. I just focused on being hyper efficient. I found myself pumping breast milk in conference rooms while editing business proposals. I know some of you are scandalized right now, but the door was shut. I ate my dinner standing up while washing the dishes. I was the poster child for leaning in. I learned to delegate, prioritize, negotiate, and when necessary, give up things like seeing friends, alone time with my husband, and hardest of all, sleep. There was just one problem. After that cute little baby was born, our son, and I returned to work full time, all this stopped working. It just seemed like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get everything done that needed to be done. My stress started to get out of control. First, I started having insomnia, and that turned into panic attacks, and eventually a kind of black depression I never knew was possible. Somehow I kept showing up at work every day, doing my job, pretending everything was fine. This went on for months until one day I simply stopped. Quietly, the way a watch stops when the battery dies. What happened is I went home sick from this fabulous job that I'd had for 6 years, and I just never went back, not even to clean off my desk. I had completely burned out. It was a year before I was ready to work again. During that year, in addition to crying and feeling like a failure and trying different forms of medication, meditation, therapy, anything I could think of, and basically running through all our savings while we tried to live on one income, I also did a lot of writing. Writing was a way for me to make sense of this wretched state I found myself in, and I really needed to make sense of it. I mean, how did it make any sense that I'd spent 37 years of my life being this capable person, and then suddenly I was a basket case? I mean, how were other women doing this? Eventually, I did what all internet professionals do in a time of crisis. I started a blog. But I'm so glad I did, because pretty soon I was hearing from women all over the country. They worked in every industry you can imagine. There were teachers, attorneys, academics, parole officers, corporate executives, web designers, journalists, you name it. Many of them told me that they too suffered from anxiety and depression. Some of them had more exotic maladies like heart palpitations or hives or mysterious coughs that wouldn't go away. The point was that, just like me, they were maxed out, just trying to work and take care of their families, and in many cases, it was making them sick. So a couple of these women randomly confessed to me that they had what I now call hospital fantasies. Any guess on what that is? A hospital fantasy is the desire to get into a minor accident so that you will be relieved for a few days from your to-do list. Now, I know, right? So I have to say, I thought this was really weird. I mean, as bad as things got for me, I never had a hospital fantasy, and I actually hate being in hospitals. But I did wonder if other people shared this strange fantasy. So I had this blog, so I just put together a poll, and I stuck it up on the blog. Guess what? Turns out 68% of the hundreds of people who took the poll said that they too had hospital fantasies. What does this mean? It's as if we can't imagine getting any real time off anymore, not even in our fantasy life, unless we're physically incapacitated. Okay, I know. Some of you are thinking, maybe this sounds a little over the top, a little shocking, but you know what? It shouldn't. Because studies show that America may be the most hostile country in the developed world for working parents of all income levels. On one hand, low-income workers are dealing with things like a complete lack of affordable childcare, rigid schedules, and no paid time off. Meanwhile, professionals are expected to work grueling hours, travel for business, and never unplug. And so even though we're experiencing this problem in different ways, the result is the same. It's chronic stress. To be fair, this is not just a women's problem. In fact, studies are showing that men, now that men are taking on more responsibility at home, they may actually be experiencing more work-life conflict than women are. So how's this playing out differently for us? Well, the short answer is that we're still stuck in traditional gender roles. And so even when both parents are working, mothers are still doing a lot more child care and housework. We're also doing a lot more multitasking. We have less leisure time, and to add salt to the wound, we feel more guilt about it and more exhaustion as well. So it shouldn't be a surprise then that women are more at risk for the health effects of this stress. We're 60% more likely to suffer an anxiety disorder. We're 70% more likely to suffer depression, and we're even more at risk for things like heart attacks and diabetes as a result of workplace stress. Okay, so I kept talking to people, I kept hearing these stories and doing the research, and I kept writing. And eventually, it just became so clear to me that what happened to me wasn't some random, isolated incident. It wasn't even uncommon. It was just a symptom of what I've come to think of as a public health crisis. Here's what's really going on. Back in the 50s and 60s, most women stopped working after they had kids, and most families could thrive on one income, for better or worse. Today, we all know that's simply no longer true. And so today, most mothers work to help support their families, and the workforce is now almost half women. And yet, society and the workplace have not in any way caught up to this reality of our lives. So we're all living in a half-changed world. On one hand, we're supposed to do our jobs as if we don't have families, and then we're supposed to be raising our families as if we don't have jobs. Lean in. Anyone who has picked up a newspaper or a magazine in the last year knows that this whole conversation about women in work has been dominated by this phrase, lean in. So in case you missed picking up a newspaper or magazine in the last year, I'll kind of explain. This is the phrase made famous by Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg. And to oversimplify just for a moment, essentially what she's telling us is that women, by leaning into their careers, they can achieve their work and life dreams by essentially summoning their internal resources and trying harder. Okay, now to be fair, this message has been empowering to many women, and there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of leaning in. But the question is, how are you supposed to lean in when you're already maxed out? As many of us have learned the hard way, sometimes you lean in and you fall right over. This isn't working. If we're serious about empowering women to be leaders, if we're serious about simply making it possible for women to be breadwinners, to support their families, then something has to give. What is it? It's time for society to lean in to parenting. Thank you. Here's what I mean by that. Let's start with policymakers. So much of this conversation is about our obsession with women. Here's what women should do, and here's how women can lean in. Let's open it up. Let's invite policymakers into this discussion for starters. Policymakers can lean in, for example, by providing things like paid parental leave and paid sick leave. Now, these two examples are things that every single country in the entire developed world offers its citizens, except the United States. We don't do it. Another thing they could do is support affordable quality childcare. This is really, really important because this would make it possible for more women to work. And when women are able to work, families get out of poverty and economies grow. So people will say, oh, it's too expensive, but you know what? Poverty is expensive. Not being able to afford to work is expensive. This is an investment in the economy. Dads. That's my husband leaning into chocolate cake with our baby. To be fair, a lot of dads, there are so many fantastic dads leaning into family, but let's be honest, we still don't have a critical mass of dads really pulling their weight at home. And to make that possible, it means that a lot of men probably need to work less, which brings me to my next point, employers. How can employers lean in? Employers can lean in by making it possible, by empowering their employees to tailor their jobs to be compatible with their lives. Now, I know that sounds like a fringe benefit. I mean, we're here in California, and it's like the crazy kind of stuff we do. But here's the thing. A lot of companies are experimenting with all kinds of ways of doing this. Things like telecommuting, better flexible options, all kinds of flexible scheduling, job shares, better part-time opportunities. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but when these things are done right, they cost almost nothing to implement. They increase productivity. They decrease turnover. They increase morale. It is such a win-win. It's not just good for our health, it's actually good for business. I want to tell you a quick story about how powerful it is when dads and employers and who's the other one I said? And policymakers, I can't forget them, lean into parenting. It's a story that takes place in Sweden. Now, believe it or not, Sweden used to have many of the same problems that we have here in the US in terms of gender equality. Moms did most of the childcare and housework at the expense of their careers, and there was a big pay gap between men and women. Now, Sweden had very generous parental leave policies, but it was almost exclusively the moms who used it. Something like 6% of dads tried staying home with their kids, and when they did, they were made fun of for being unmanly. Anyone speak Swedish in the audience? They were called a word, velourpappa. I'm probably saying it wrong. It means velvet dad. So they were made fun of for being softies. So policymakers in Sweden said, this isn't right. We're going to do something different. We're going to try an experiment. We're going to set aside 1 month of parental leave just for dads. Now, they don't have to stay home with their baby, but if they don't take that 1 month, the family loses the subsidies. Now, suddenly, the people of Sweden had this dilemma because the men were like, well, who cares if they call me a velvet dad? I'm not giving up free money. No one wants to do that. So dads started staying home with their babies for the first time, and everything started to change. Because dads started bonding with their babies in a new way when they were in charge, when mom wasn't around. And even after they returned to work, they started taking on some of the responsibilities that were traditionally the mom jobs, like giving baths and clipping the fingernails and setting up dentist appointments. Meanwhile, moms started returning to work a little bit sooner. The pay gap between men and women, this thing that we're always talking about, it's stuck, we can't do anything about it, well, it started to close. Employers saw, and this is really important, employers saw that this whole work-life balance issue, it wasn't a women's issue, it was an everybody issue. And so the culture at work finally began to change, with things like flex time becoming more common. Even the divorce rate started to go down. I'm not making this up. It's amazing. So this one simple change had this profound effect on society. Okay, I know you're probably thinking, how does this apply to the US? We don't even have parental leave for mothers. We don't have paid parental leave for mothers. But that's not the point. The point is that when policymakers and dads and employers all decided to do things a little bit differently, when they decided to show that they actually value what it takes to care for a family, that's when things started to change. Okay, when I started this talk, I started by telling you about how I maxed out 5 years ago. Back then, what I wished for more than anything was to be able to hang on to my career and still be the kind of mom that I needed to be to my kids. Since I'm still here on stage, you probably guessed the story has a happy ending. About a year after I stopped working, I started working again for myself. Today, I do the same kind of work that I did 5 years ago, but now I'm in charge. I do most of it from home, and I'm thriving. I will be honest, self-employment is not perfect. It's not that I never get overworked, but I have the flexibility that I need now, and it's manageable. So this isn't a talk about why you should quit your job, although it sounds like it is. But I know it's not realistic for everyone to just start their own business. However, I think it's important to see that most jobs can be made compatible with our lives if we use some imagination. So here's my wish for you. When you leave here today, my hope is that you will open your mind and think creatively. Ask yourself, how can I make my workplace a healthier place for myself, for my coworkers, and for my employees? Because it is time to lean in, but not just to our jobs. It's time to lean into our lives. And when we figure out how to do that, it won't just benefit women. It will benefit everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and we're back. So now as we somewhat begin to wrap up, we're going to put you all in breakout rooms because again, as we discussed the questions, we want to dive deeper, right? We want to lean into some of those statements and things that she was bringing up in this TED Talk. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms. Some of you will remain in the main room with me, but we are going to test this out. I've done it before, but again, sometimes we max out of using Zoom and forget how to do things. So some of you are gonna stay here and then we're gonna break out in the other 2 rooms. And one is going to be with Dr. Isgro and the other group is going to be with Dr. Misra. So bear with me for this moment.
We'll take about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms and then we'll come back together and sort of reconvene and bounce ideas off each other.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. I hope no one was in the middle of speaking. That's always the most awkward part of trying to bring people back from breakout rooms. So I'm so sorry if any of you were speaking or in the middle of speaking. It's so hard to tell when you're not in the room with everyone. But thank you so much, everyone. I don't know if Dr. Isgro or Dr. Misra wants to share anything.
Well, I'm real curious, and part of what we were able to tie back in with the discussion that we had in our readings for this week in my leadership class was the idea of powerful and powerless speech. Mm-hmm. And being able to find one's voice. So part of being empowered is really being able to figure out how do you have agency and how do you ask for what you need, and then support those that are actually supporting you and your families or society. Just some thoughts that I've been having. I don't know if there's other people in the group that would like to share. We had a pretty lively conversation.
Does anyone want to share? It's pretty much open up. Does anyone want to share any big takeaways that they got from their groups? Any interesting things that they heard in their breakout rooms? Anyone care to share anything?
Something that I took away from our conversation was the importance of a strong sense of community and community-based intervention. And that could not only just help the situation that we're talking about, but so many other things. And I think it's so important that we as people who have the opportunity to engage in these conversations take this and kind of do what we can to not only educate ourselves about the situation, include ourselves in working towards helping find solutions and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we, our group also, I just wanted to bounce off that because it's so related to what we talked as well. We really sort of started zoning in towards the end of our conversation at this idea of, moving from empowerment as a very personal thing, as a very individual thing, right, to sort of a more systemic approach to it. So some of the people, there were such great points, but just sort of mentioning how while we need to do all the things that the talk mentions, right, create better policies and have paid parental leave, how do we start changing the culture of an organization where such systemic barriers still exist in our society, in terms of access to education, who gets that relief, the COVID relief, right? So many things where there's such disparity still in our society in terms of race, in terms of class. So I really like, Leah, what you just mentioned about local and community solutions. I think it really starts at the very local level because we tend to look at these things also so much. And I think the policy level is important, but right here, right now, in our community in Plattsburgh, how do we start thinking about that, right? How do we merge the question of equity and access to education with the idea of care work and equity in care work, right? So that's a fantastic point. And I can't remember, I think it was Autumn who also brought up this idea of, which really touched me, which I think was kind of making me think a lot while I was watching the talk, and I'm sure this resonated with a lot of us, is that there is something about care work, about looking after someone, whether it be a child or it be an elderly person, that is so emotional that never gets captured in any kind of organizational. Yes, Bridget, we don't need to wait for another national policy. Yes, I like that. But it cannot, that is the aspect of care work, I think, that intangible emotional aspect. And Dr. Isgro, maybe you would like to highlight your book for us as well, because I know that in the book there are lots of contributors who talk about this when they talk about motherhood in academia, that intangible aspect of emotional labor, right, that we cannot capture with any policy. So again, our discussion went back to, so how do we create that kind of culture where we can work together and thrive, and while understanding that not everybody wants to be a parent, not everybody fits in that very cis heterosexual model of parenting as well that the video shows, but how do we still all be caring human beings and coexist with each other? And personally for me, I don't want to talk too much, but just personally for me, I can say that I've been a parent, a mother, as a student in 2 different countries with both my kids, and I'm about to become a parent once more as a young faculty member at SUNY Plattsburgh. And there is a lot of mental trauma that we all carry as well, which I'm sure, again, resonates with everybody in terms of our past life, things that we've experienced that is triggered when you become a parent, right? So where are those spaces to talk about mental health as well? So I just want to end with that, but I'm just flagging some of the nice comments that we are getting here in our chat box as well. Yeah, and Tanner is again pointing to the sort of intersectionality of that, of the question of access and experience.
So a couple of things as I can't see the chat box for a minute, so if you can take on to that. But so this is where I do the self-promotion, right? In terms of, I had worked on a book project about 5 years ago, looking at mothers in academia in particular, but it really was sort of a slice of this larger conversation about how do organizations create a culture of care that is beneficial to everybody. You know, that the rise of women is not about the fall of men, and that everyone can play a role in forging gender parity, and that gender balance isn't just a women's issue, but it's also an economic issue. And so when we look at all of these sort of organizational pieces, how do we support each other? I think is very instrumental in terms of having a life full of dignity and respect. And what does that look like on our individual levels and organizational levels, and then these larger global issues around policy. So I don't know if that was a nice little tidy summary in terms of pitching this idea of care work, but sociologists talk about care work and the emotional labor that often does fall on those who are more feminine, which may or may not be female. So there's the culture of care, there's the emotional labor, and then there's also the second shift where, you know, or third shift. So, you know, women that are working in the workforce and then come home and they have a whole other body of work to do, whether it's caring for children or their elderly parents or siblings, in addition to housework. So there's all these different levels of this gender balance.
Yeah,
Can I go?
go ahead.
So in the group I was in, we talked about like the things we agreed with and stuff, like with the Sweden story, how it is important that fathers get time with their children too, because they took part in, you know, having a child too, and it's important for them to have that emotional bond with them as well. And mothers undergo a lot of things with postpartum too, so they might want some normalcy to go to work and have some help. But we also talked about, and what they didn't include was people of color and disabled people, and how when we get a chance to enforce policies or make changes in the work conditions, that we need to just not think about only ourselves. We need to think about how it can be a positive change that is inclusive for everyone.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Carly. And the different ideas of parenting or caregiving as well, right? That come with that intersectionality as well. Quite often, you know, we have, or there is a very middle class heteronormative idea of what it means to take care and how to take care as well, right? And we judge people against those standards. But, you know, if you are a person of color or a disabled person or our parent too or caregiver of someone who doesn't fall into that norm, then the idea of the flexibility in that culture of care is really important as well. Thank you.
Evelyn, do you want to share the example you were talking about in terms of this policing and sort of resisting those alternative family structures that you had, the example that you had shared?
Yeah, I brought up this story that happened about a month ago. It was this woman in Ohio. She has 2 children, and from my understanding, she was a single mother, and she didn't have anyone to watch her kids, so she like rented out a motel room and she left them there for the day. And I believe the ages of the kids, like one was 11 and the other one was 8, so yeah, they're a little bit young. But someone called the cops and she was arrested and charged with child endangerment. And I was just telling my group, it's like insane how they would like, instead of maybe directing her towards like more resources, like childcare, like to get like apply for these programs that could help her pay for childcare instead of needing to leave her child alone. The community ended up setting up a GoFundMe and they raised over $150,000 for her, and she was able to like provide like care for her kids. But it's just crazy how like it's always up to the community to make change, not like leaders or like law enforcement, you know? So, yeah.
Thank you, Evelyn.
I'm trying to like balance the talking and making sure no one's trying to unmute themselves. 100%. I think the way that story came out really just shook me to the core, because again, we talk about, you know, community and how much more impact we're able to commit as a community, and really grassroots organizations, right? One individual starting up a GoFundMe, and you know, how many times have we seen GoFundMes come up and really save people's lives and their livelihoods in times where we should already have it as a natural right, in some capacities, and have these services accessible to us and resources accessible to us. So really making sure that we discuss, when we're talking about policies and rights, you know, we are also examining what are the ways that each of us personally can impact change, right? What are the ways that each of us can talk to a student or a colleague and bring some of these topics up, talk about these relationships. And, you know, in our group, we discussed, you know, how many of us are caregivers, right? And sometimes when we think about caregiving, we think, like we said, that one frame parenting. We think of us having children or adopted children, in that capacity, when really it's us having grandparents that we might be taking care of, or we may be having cousins, sisters, brothers, and we're that sole provider. Funny enough, this event is happening, and I got a phone call from my house, asking me about taking care of my cousins, about what are they supposed to do. So again, it's consistent happening all the time, and things of that nature. But with that said, we are wrapping up, and we want to thank you all for coming. Please know that this is just part one of the conversation. We invite you to part two, which is going to be a panel discussion on March 26th at 6 p.m. If you're interested in being a panelist and talking about your experience here in Plattsburgh, again, this is open to anyone, whether you're faculty, staff, or student. If you identify as a mother or caregiver of some sort, please reach out to any of the three of us. Let us know. We would be happy to have you. But really, truly, thank you so much. I don't know if either one of you have any last minute thoughts.
Just again, I want to thank my leadership class for letting them share this time, and hopefully you can see the overlaps with this topic with what we've been talking about throughout the semester.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Isgro and Zyaijah and everybody over here. I just wanted to end with asking everybody to choose to challenge today something very mundane in their life. So while we choose to challenge on Women's Day, of course, horrible things like sex work, like violence against women, like the lack of education, let's choose to challenge also something as mundane as care work. So let's look around us and see who does the bulk of the care work, and how can we start making those small changes in our lives and communities. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.